Good day, and welcome to our interview with John Snow. I am Brooks Spence for the National Railroad Hall of Fame and our oral history program called Spirit of the Railroaders. We are at the Ipswich Inn in a snowdrift in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and we are going to spend this session with Mr. Snow, who was former U.S. Treasury Secretary and, importantly, Chairman and CEO of CSX Corporation. And as is our custom, we're here to profile the life and career of those individuals who had an impact on our industry. So with that said, let's dive in. John, welcome. Glad to have you here. Thank you for coming to join us.
Well, thanks very much. Honor and privilege to be here. And I must say I've enjoyed your good interviews with so many railroad leaders that I've known and admired over the years, including my predecessor, Hayes Watkins.
Yes, and I'm sure we will get into that in some depth here. We like to do a complete profile, so we would like to start beginning with your early years in Toledo and then carry on.
My misspent youth.
Your misspent youth, yes, yes. As you were saying earlier, the education that you went through was instructive. So please let us know.
Well, my dad was a lawyer, and with a tax practice and an interest in antitrust law. Toledo, Ohio was home. He'd grown up there. My mom had grown up there. She was a school teacher. Chairman of the English department at a big high school in Toledo, and I often got my grammar corrected by her. You know, you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition. And
don't
so
split
on.
infinitives.
Yeah, but as Churchill said, that's up with that I will not put.
Right.
Wish I'd known that when my mom was correcting me. But my dad he loved the practice of law, but he really loved ideas. He was a natural intellectual, and he loved probing ideas, and so the conversation around the breakfast table or dinner table was always fascinating with him. Politics, philosophy. He loved Bertrand Russell, who was at that time, a leading intellectual in the world. Yeah. Whitehead, Wittgenstein, who developed the, new math. All of those people were familiar to me as I was growing up. And to my sister, who went on to pursue an academic career. She's about 5 years younger, and we had wonderful conversations around the dinner table with my dad, always focused on not how to make money, which was of secondary interest to him, but how does the world work? What's behind this? What's behind that? So I grew up in an intellectual environment. With law and economics and politics, in history and philosophy, commonplace discussion.
Were you inspired to go into the law because of his background and career?
I think in part. Interesting, when I would talk with him, even though the subject would be law, I came to realize that the underlying substance of what we were talking about was economics. And that triggered in me an interest in knowing more about economics and how the economy functions, and but always had the aspirations to go on and be in the law world. As probably antitrust trial lawyer was probably my aspirations, like my dad.
So off you go to university, and as you were saying earlier, that there were some challenges with the circumstances there.
Finances. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Gates Mills and Gilmore Academy. I ended up at Gilmore Academy, which was a Catholic private boys school in outside of Cleveland, Shaker Heights. Gates Mills, Shaker Heights, East Cleveland. Because my dad decided that I was spending too much time on sports and basketball in particular, and maybe too much with pursuing young ladies, and I ought to go off to a boys' school and get away from the temptations that I was succumbing to. So sent me off to this private boys' school, and after graduating from Gilmore, went to Kenyon College, a small liberal arts college in Central Ohio.
How did you pick that?
He picked it for me.
Okay.
I think he had grown up in the recession in the Great Depression, and would have gone either to Columbia or Kenyon, except his family finances turned sour with the Great Depression, as with so many other families at that time, and the ability to go off to Kenyon or Columbia, his two choices, disappeared. So I think when I came time to go to college, he sort of pointed me. I didn't want to go to New York. I liked Ohio. I wanted to be in Ohio. He pointed me to Kenyon, which was a good experience.
Sure. Sure.
At least until the bursar's office kept calling me and saying, "Where's the tuition money?" And I sort of got tired of that at some point and knew the family finances were strained. Kenyon was expensive, and I then transferred to got a job actually in Toledo as an athletic director of a boys' school, and coached basketball.
Oh, really?
and taught American history. And went to college at the University of Toledo. Finished up at the University of Toledo.
Did you like teaching?
I enjoyed teaching. Yeah, I enjoyed teaching.
Because you went off after graduating, you went off to teach for a while.
Well, yeah, I went to the university. Got a fellowship to the University of Virginia, a National Defense Education Act fellowship. Remember Sputnik?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Sputnik triggered an interest on the part of the American government in training people in the sciences, and economics was included in the sciences. And some people would question the wisdom of doing that, but it was. And I got a National Defense Education Act fellowship to the University of Virginia, and had a great experience there. Studied under two wonderful guys, Nobel Prize winners in economics that changed the face of economics. Jim Buchanan, who developed the theory of choice, public choice, and a fellow named Ronald Coase, who pioneered the relationship between law and economics. Two Nobel Prize winners who became, my professors.
So after that, you end up joining a law firm in D.C.
In D.C., yeah.
And any particular specialty?
Well, actually, it turns out that was the law firm that represented railroads, among other things, and MCI, the telecommunications companies. So I was what was known as administrative law, a regulatory law practice. And then I got a call from a friend who was in the Department of Transportation as an assistant general counsel there. And he had gotten an opportunity from his law firm to go to London and play a big role in opening up a London office. And he said, "John, you ought to be my successor here. And I want to put you in touch with the general counsel, a fellow named John Barnum, who had just recently come to the department." John had been a New York lawyer at Cravath. And I met with John Barnum, and he hired me, and I ended up going to the Department of Transportation.
And who was DOT secretary?
DOT secretary at that time was a fellow named Claude Brinegar, who was out of the oil industry. A good guy, a thoughtful guy, and I ended up being close to him. And then, of course, what happened was Watergate, and my friend, who was the general counsel, got promoted to the undersecretary, because the nominee for undersecretary ended up being one of the plumbers, and no longer could pass the Senate confirmation test. So John Barnum, a wonderful guy, very able guy, moved up to be the undersecretary, and they caused me to move up in the ranks at the department and move into the policy and legislative arena. And that got me involved in the deregulation, the creation of Conrail, the deregulation stuff that became so central to what I did for the next many years.
So in 1973, you get married.
Right.
And you want to talk a little bit about that? Because according to what I've read, she had a very important career as well.
Carolyn, yeah, my wife Carolyn was a scientist. She'd gone to the University of Maryland and taken a master's, undergrad and master's degree in microbiology, and they wanted her to go on and get a PhD. She would have been a wonderful professor. Keen analytical mind, good with statistics and math and numbers and research. And she ended up going to the National Academy of Sciences. She went to Georgetown Medical School, She had a number of positions in Washington. Ended up being the deputy director of the Office of Healthcare at NASA, and from NASA she was good at analogies. And remember, NASA would send people out into space and then lose contact with them for a brief period of time. Well, that's what happens with parents and their teenagers. So she analogized our difficulty communicating with our wonderful son during that period of his teenage years, when kids have to break away from their parents, as that time when at NASA headquarters was out of touch with the astronauts, just as we sort of got out of touch for a while. And you got to count on the fact that all the training and background takes and remains, the constant in the lives of the astronauts and your teenage kids.
So back to Carolyn. How did you meet? You're a busy guy.
I was at the Department of Transportation early on in my career, really beginning, and was also teaching at GW Law School as an adjunct prof, and we met through a mutual friend. And it didn't take us long to realize there was something special there. And a year or so later, we got married.
And had a good long run.
Yeah. She was a wonderful companion and a wonderful support. And as they say, she was the real talent in the family.
So you go to DOT, and can you talk about your government service, because you were in the administration up till 1975?
Well, it was a transformative for me. I was a trial lawyer at the law firm, preparing briefs and playing sort of the role of a young lawyer, a lot of time in the library, and carrying the briefcases for the senior lawyers. And then I ended up, as the assistant general counsel, not only not carrying the briefcases, but making the arguments before the regulatory agencies. And my modest amount of experience as a regulatory lawyer at the ICC and the CAB at that time, the Civil Aeronautics Board, now gone, the Maritime Commission, where I'd done some work, the FCC, where I'd done some work, put me in a good position, because few of the lawyers at the Department of Transportation had actually appeared in cases or written briefs to these agencies and so on, and I'd done a fair amount of that. So that background helped me, especially since the department had an agenda to reform transportation. And I got into that mix and was trying to make the case at the regulatory agencies when I was in the litigation world about why a different regulatory framework would be good, and then got promoted to the assistant general counsel for legislation, where we wrote the legislative reform proposals of the then Ford administration, because with Watergate, Nixon leaves, and as I say, my stars somehow shone, and my friend becomes the undersecretary. I get the light shone on me a little brighter, and I move up into the policy arena, and was given the leadership role on the deregulation initiatives that really grew out of President Ford's concern with inflation and inefficiencies that the government was creating that were played back on the economy, the misallocation of resources as a result of government policy.
So is that the germ of deregulation? It started with Ford?
Ford really was a catalyst for it. There had been some earlier initiatives, but they'd gone nowhere.
Who had started that discussion?
Well, it started with Alan Boyd,
oh, right.
A guy named John Robson, the original DOT team. DOT was created a few years earlier when Johnson was president, and it was a new agency when I got there, only 6 years old. It was fresh.
Yeah, sure.
And it had a youthfulness about it, and a creativity about it, and a willingness to challenge things. But the earlier efforts had failed, and Claude Brinegar asked me to study those. The secretary asked me to study those earlier efforts, and he was reform-minded, but he wanted to benefit from the lessons of the past. Sure. All the prior efforts had failed.
Why? Do you know?
Yeah, fundamentally because economists, not the political people, drove the process, and they used economic models, and economists focus on misallocation of resources and optimization models and the benefits of competition and competitive models and the math of competitive models. Basically, a misallocation of resources focus, and that didn't have much political legs to it. So you can talk to a congressman about the misallocation of resources, or you can tell them parables and stories about how this regulation affects in an unfavorable way his constituents. And what fell to me was to translate the misallocation of resources into parables, and going to congressmen and senators and saying, if this regulation is harmful to your constituents. Because of this regulation, transportation costs are a lot higher. Because of this, I remember talking to Senator Kennedy. Because of these CAB rules on entry and pricing, the cost of your constituents going to visit their children in Boston to LA is much higher, probably 40 to 50% higher than it would be in a competitively structured, open entry, competitive airline industry. Fortunately for me, a fellow named Steve Breyer became his aide. Steve had been a lawyer, a professor at the Harvard Law School who'd studied regulation and written on it. And Steve really was very helpful in persuading Kennedy that airline deregulation made sense, and Kennedy became a champion for it. And I think in part because it was a politically appealing idea, lowering airfares by 40% and allowing grandparents to visit their grandkids, making it affordable, had a lot of political appeal to it. So we took the what fell to us to do under Brinegar, and then even more so under his successor, Bill Coleman, a prominent L.A. lawyer from Philadelphia, gifted fellow, who worked beautifully with John Barnum, another gifted lawyer, to see how to package these ideas and sell them.
Sell it as a story rather than...
Bill, I remember sitting with Bill, just about like we're here now, with a couple other of the policy people. He'd called us into his office, and he wanted to impress us with a point. And he said, my job, he pointed that way, is to deal with them, make sure we have the go-ahead from them, and that's the White House. And then he pointed the other way. That was the other side of Pennsylvania, the Congress. And my job is to take what I can get from them and translate it and sell it up there. But you've got to give us the ideas. You're the idea factory. I'm going to put it into action. So Bill understood the role of a cabinet secretary. Deal with the White House, deal with the Hill. Sure. But have good people around to generate lots of good ideas. And he did. He brought in a superb team.
So this is what led to the rail revitalization?
Absolutely. And in the background to all of this, of course, was the collapse of the Penn Central. It fell on DOT to come up with some plan to deal with it, the bankrupt estate. The 3R Act and the 4R Act came out of all that, and that led to the creation of Conrail. And Bill USTRA came up with the big Conrail plan, and we had another plan. The Coleman plan was to divide the East up between basically N and W and the Chessie. And Hayes Watkins, that you interviewed, he probably talked about it, was willing to take his piece of the bankrupt estates of the Northeast, but a fellow named Jack Fishwick and something called Derrico that you may have talked about, had a very different view. And the irony of all of that is 22 decades plus later, NS, which of course grew out of the N&W and Southern, and CSX that grew out of the Chesapeake in Ohio, Baltimore, Ohio collection of families, Chessie, and Seaboard, put together a proposal with Norfolk Southern to divide Conrail. So I called Bill and I said, Bill, we couldn't get it done when you were secretary, but it's being done right now. And he was delighted to know that the Coleman plan finally came to light.
So my recollection was when Penn Central failed, there were somewhere around 105,000 employees and just a huge raft of light density lines and so forth. And politically, it was difficult to say, well, we're going to downsize, the labor and all of that, which ultimately ended up happening. But how did you deal with? I mean, obviously, you had to reshape what was there, what had failed. How did you deal with the political aspects of all of that?
Well, the politics that were compelling. You couldn't let it all collapse.
Right.
The economy of the country would have collapsed. Penn Central was such a critical part of it, and the other bankrupt estates, the whole group of them. It wasn't just Penn Central.
Right.
The whole Northeast, and it threatened the whole country. Actually, the whole national rail system was put in jeopardy. So we had to patch it up and hold it together and get it funded by Congress. And Congress had lost confidence, I think, some in the Interstate Commerce Commission and some in the FRA and DOT. So they set up their own entity. Although DOT John Barnum particularly had a big role in drafting that 3R Act, 4R Act legislation that created USTRA, that sent Jim Hagan and a whole bunch of the FRA people out of FRA over to USTRA to do what they would have done if they'd stayed at FRA and
Right.
plan the future of the bankrupt estates. It was a seminal period, and what Conrail ended up doing when the government owned it and didn't find a buyer for it was compel the Congress to understand that there was a deep-seated problem here, and it was very costly because Conrail continued to be a very unprofitable operation that was a drain on the U.S. Treasury. And once Congress had to fund it, the pro-deregulation ideas sort of came to the forefront. There was a fellow over at Conrail, a brilliant guy named John Sweeney, who's one of the heroes of the whole deregulation effort, and was sort of the brain trust of Conrail, and he pitched the Conrail leadership on the idea we've got to get deregulated. We've got to change the structure. What ails us is a deep-seated structural problem that grows from the fact we're regulated in a way that won't allow us to earn our cost of capital. And we've got to shed a lot of lines, we've got to shed a lot of capacity, we've got to shed a lot of people, we've got to streamline things, and we can't do that within a regulatory framework we got. In other words, the whole regulatory framework has to go. And it was that experience, I think, that persuaded Jim Florio and Ed Madigan, who were the chairs of the appropriate committee in the House, to push what was then the Staggers Act, became the Staggers Act. It was the Magna Carta of railroads. It set it became the new standard, the liberation day for railroads.
Right. So when Carter becomes president, then you departed.
I stayed for a little while with Brock Adams, who was the new secretary. Asked me to stay on. I was then out of the regulatory rail business. I was in the regulatory business, running an agency called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which was responsible for airbags and seat belts and bumper standards and tire standards and crash standards and as it turned out, the first. In fact, I was the administrator that put into effect the first EPA, the first rules on mileage, the famous mileage rules. How many miles a car ought to get,
Right.
and that changed the whole auto industry. No, so I spent a couple of months as an interim with an awkward experience, I recall, painfully. I got a call from the reporter at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal that asked me, what I thought of the Carter rule. Carter didn't like. Carter was an innovative president, and he got behind the deregulation. But he, in order to streamline government and get rid of excess rules, he set up a policy, an executive order that required the cabinet secretaries to personally review all the executive orders that came out of their departments. It was a well-intentioned action by the White House. But this reporter, and I supported it, except it was totally unfeasible. There's so many executive orders come out of rules and regulations come out of these departments that if a secretary had to read them all, you'd have nothing else to do. So a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, I think, or maybe the New York Times, interviewed me and asked me what I thought of these rules. And I said, well, my heart's with them, but I don't think they're practicable because, as I said, if the secretaries had to read all these rules, everything else would come to a blazing halt. Well, that was the quote. And I got called into the secretary's office and over to the White House saying, "What? You're an interim guy. What are you doing, attacking us?" And I said, "I didn't mean to. The spirit of my comment was in support." Anyway, they had to get. I had to move on. I was a Republican, and then I went to a halfway house for out-of-office Republicans called the American Enterprise Institute, which was a great experience because. Over there with me was a fellow named Paul McAvoy, who had been in the administration on the Council of Economic Advisors and was one of the country's leading economists at the time. And he'd gone back to Yale and was spending part-time at AEI. And he and I collaborated on a series of books, 3 books, on the deregulation experience. Airlines, a book on the airline deregulation, a book on the railroad deregulation, and a book on the maybe the toughest of all, the motor carrier deregulation, maybe the most important of all, the motor carrier deregulation. So Paul and I had a good time, and I then became a visiting fellow or professor or something at Yale, and would spend a lot of time going back and forth between Washington and Yale, and writing these books, and spending time at the American Enterprise Institute. And we had a group on deregulation, that Paul chaired, and I was active in it. But it included Steve Breyer, who was, and a fellow who you may have heard of named Nino Scalia, who'd been in the Justice Department, and served with me on this policy board that President Ford created. President Ford was concerned about inflation, as I mentioned, and the inefficiencies in the government that became a burden on the performance of the economy, held back growth and prosperity. And he set up a board called the Presidential Reform Advisory Board or something. And Nino was on that board, and it was a policy level person from every cabinet agency to come up with proposals that the government could do to reform itself. And DOT ended up being the richest cornucopia of inefficiencies of all the government agencies. So we came forward when asked, what could you do to improve the performance of the American economy coming from your venue? We came up with airline deregulation, truck deregulation, motor carrier deregulation, air freight deregulation, waterways deregulation, and sent these proposals to the White House. And then ultimately they got the approval of the White House to take them to the Hill. So this was the catalyst for what happened later, because we had it in the Congress legislation to reform airlines regulation, truck regulation, railroad, and it was interesting that the CEOs of the airlines didn't like it. By and large, the CEOs of the truck lines hated it. The Teamsters hated it. The railroads were deeply divided. Hayes Watkins was a minority in pushing for deregulation. So these champions of free enterprise, these champions of these captains of American industry, right. Like the devil they knew better than the devil they didn't know.
How was it received on the Capitol Hill when you started to put it around?
Very little support.
Really?
Very, very little support. It took, we pushed it for 2 years or so, and then we were out, 2 or 3 years, and then we were out. Carter was really made the difference. The Carter administration got behind it, full bore, 100%. I mean, Jimmy Carter was transformational in that regard. He pushed airline, truck, railroads, all of it. For some reason, he developed an antipathy to regulation. He had a good mind, and I think he had to get peanut licenses or something. And he found the process of getting peanut licenses from the government really cumbersome and inefficient, and took a dislike to it. And well, there are a lot of stories how this all came about. But his initial transportation secretary, Brock Adams, that I had mentioned, was not a fan of deregulation. He was status quo. He'd been a very influential member of Congress on transportation policy, and liked the world he knew, and was at best for modest reforms. Carter wanted far-reaching reforms, and Carter ended up firing Adams and bringing in people that were more deregulation-minded. A guy named Goldschmidt, who'd been the mayor of Portland, I think, and went on to become the governor. And it was that combination of a new people at DOT and strong backing from Carter and his team at the White House that really propelled this legislation, the deregulation forward in all those arenas, airlines, trucks, motor carriers, much to the consternation of the industries.
Is this when Darius Gaskin showed up at the ICC?
Yeah, he was appointed to be the chairman of the ICC by Carter. Carter saw it. Somehow it was really serendipity that Darius, with that keen intellect of his and an eye for innovation, for change, and that gritty spirit to make it happen, was the right guy at the right time. And I was then in the railroad industry representing the Chessie system in Washington as the Carter administration was pushing this legislation. And Darius being chairman made a notable change, because the ICC lawyers, who were the champions of the ICC in regulation, began to recognize, wow, we don't have a champion here anymore. We're getting questioned on things like the efficacy of rate bureaus,
right.
And why truck lines shouldn't be allowed to enter new markets. And the routine public convenience and necessity cases that always rejected new applicants were finding that new applicants were being admitted into the new markets. So the truckers began to say, wow, there's a new world, and the railroads began saying there's a new world. And maybe deregulation isn't so bad, because we're getting deregulated through this new character, Darius Gaskins, as we speak at the ICC. So it changed he may not have realized it, but by changing the climate at the regulator itself, becoming less hospitable to the old status quo, it moved the industry more to acceptance of change.
So back up just a bit, because you went from government service to this AEI.
Yeah, AEI, and to teaching. I took a term at the. Gosh, I had an interesting life then. I was at AEI. I was teaching at the University of Virginia. Had an appointment there at the economics department, professor of economics, and with the law school, and was also at Yale. And that Yale thing continued. I had to give up the.
So how much time you?
I was bouncing around.
Yeah, it sounds
and writing those books, and bouncing around a lot. It was a fun time. It was a fun, but it was before Christopher, our child, that Carolyn will arrive a few years later.
So how did you get from all of that? It's a big leap to get in the railroad business.
Yeah, it was. I started in the railroad industry as a lawyer, basically. I mean, Hayes may have told you the story. I was at AEI, and he came to see me, and I had just pretty much inked a deal with a big Philadelphia law firm to run their Washington office. They were setting up a Washington office and wanted somebody to run it. They had one. I wanted to expand it. And Hayes came to see me at AEI, And in fact, as it turned out, Jerry Ford was right down the hall because he took an interim role at AEI as well. And I didn't know Hayes at all well. I knew of him, of course, but I didn't know him well. And he said, I'd like you to think about coming to work for me. And I said, well, Hayes, that's great. I'm about to become the managing partner of a law firm here in town. You'll be my first client. He said, no. I don't want to have you represent me from a law firm. I want you to be in the company as a vice president over government affairs or something. I said, Hayes, gosh, I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a business guy. I'd be out of out of water. It's not my role. I'm a lawyer. Lawyers do projects. We do piecework. Sounds like you got a project in mind, and I'd love to take it on. He said, you got to do this from inside the firm. And I argued with him, and he said, look, at your age, there are few people who are going to be vice presidents of a major company. You ought to take it. If you don't like it in a couple of years, you can. We'll talk about things. So I took it sort of reluctantly. I'm glad I did. And he may have told you the story about how a couple of years later he calls me from Washington to Cleveland, the headquarters, and the legislation on deregulation is moving along, and he wants a briefing, and he assembles all the senior managers. And this is the famous 10-2 vote. He probably
you need to drill into that for our audience here, because that's a very good story.
So he calls me to Washington. He said, "I need you to from Washington to Cleveland. 7:00 meeting in the Terminal Tower building, and I'm going to have all the senior people there, and I want you to brief us on where the deregulation efforts where they stand." So I came well prepared to talk about it, and had the floor for 30 minutes or so and gave a briefing. And then we had a little discussion, and Steve and Hayes said, I think we really ought to go around the table and see where we are on this. Do we want to support it or not? And he says, I want to vote. Let's get a vote here, John. Ask you to vote first. Are you for it or against it? Should we support the deregulation? And I looked around the room and all these grimaces. And I said,
and you're the youngest guy.
I'm the youngest guy and the most junior guy, the newest and the most junior in the room. And I said, Hayes, I know there's a lot of concern about it, how it would turn out, and a lot of views that the devil we know is better than but I'll tell you, I think we're not doing well with regulation. The regulatory framework is out of step with what we need to be doing for the industry. So I would vote. No assurances here, but I'd vote to try it anyway. And if we show support for it, we'll at least have a seat at the table and can maybe help influence how it goes. Then Hayes turns to the rest, and the rest are all in opposition. The fellow who headed up pricing said, no, it would be chaos without rate bureaus. Without getting together, we could never set rates. And the general counsel said, it just couldn't work. Railroads are structured as common carriers, and this legislation would make us contract carriers. And if we're contract carriers, then we'd be at the mercy of these big shippers who would beat us over the heads and drive down rates. And on around the table they go, and it's now 2-1, 3-1, 4-1, 5-1, 7-1, 11-1. And it's Hayes. And finally, he says, well, it's my turn to vote. And I vote with John. Wow.
Right, the motion is carried.
Lincoln's cabinet.
Yeah.
Remember that famous story how Lincoln carried the day on a 11-1 vote or something?
Yeah.
His own cabinet.
Right.
No, so, and the irony was, there was a deep lesson in all this for me. It's one thing to get legislation passed in the Congress or even get the regulatory bodies to support you. But unless you get the heart and mind and the soul of the people that have to implement things with you, you're not going to get it done. It's not going to go anywhere. And to get the heart and the soul of the people, you got to be one of them. You got to be inside. So this was a brilliant insight on Hayes' part, way beyond anything I could have seen.
So you have this vote, and the 2-11 or 2-10 vote carried the day. And then this unfolds over time because you're now with the railroad, and maybe you can take us through how that how you transition from
Well,
there.
the transition was the creation of CSX, which joined the Seaboard Coastline with the Chessie system. In 1980, we got that approved, and the company was set up in Richmond, Virginia, as a neutral headquarters. This was a 50-50 merger.
And Hayes was careful to point out that he and Prime Osborne had a very collegial 50-50 relationship.
Much. The whole philosophy was 50-50. And the whole philosophy was also a holding company, 50-50. And so half of the people that went to CSX in Richmond were from Seaboard and L&N and that family of companies, and the other half from the old Chessie system, B&O and Western Maryland and C&O. So that was religion with them, and they were a marvelous pair. Co-CEOs don't often work well. This was a counter example. This one worked well because they had such respect for each other, and they were both so talented, and they shared a philosophy. And part of that philosophy was that the holding company was a holding company, and it was to focus on strategy and broad corporate ideas, not operations. So we were all told, you're not operators, you're staff people, and you're a cost. You're not a profit center, you're a cost. So watch costs, and we're going to be small and dedicated to staff functions. And this was drilled into us. We were the finance functions, and we oversaw the corporate policy functions, politics and government and relations. But when it came to running the businesses, that was the railroads. They ran the businesses. We weren't to interfere. So that became very, very central. But I got invited, sort of surprisingly, coming out of Washington. Was invited by the new board, and that meant Hayes and Prime, primarily, to be the senior vice president over a number of functions, including law and public policy and some strategy activities and corporate secretary and public relations, communications, a lot of those functions. And the other senior vice president was finance. So we had the staff functions, finance, and the other staff functions under two senior vice presidents. And I was sort of surprised choice to go there. So was in on the foundation of this and understood their philosophy. And they set up in Richmond a policy board. And the policy board originally was the two railroad presidents, the president of the Seaboard Coastline, Paul Funkhauser, and the president of the Chessie system, a guy named John Collinson, and Hayes and Prime. And the rest of us were just staff to that. We weren't allowed in the meetings. This was like the meeting of the Cardinals or something. Eventually, after a year or two, I think or a year or so, they decided that maybe some staff people ought to be in the meeting. So the Bob Hintz, the very able CFO, and I were invited into these meetings. So we got to wear the robes, I guess. And so I was there at the very, very beginning, and this was a large responsibility, but staff work. And after a few years, Prime stepped aside. Hayes became the sole CEO, and asked me, basically told me, that my next step was to be the president of the Chessie System Railroads. And
how did that hit you?
And well, that brings me back to that meeting of a few years earlier and the 10-2 vote. because now I was the CEO overseeing a number of those people who had voted the other way. And I knew there had to be changes, and there were changes. And I think that was a test. Hayes, I think, was looking to see, did I have what it took to deal with a problem he wouldn't want to have dealt with, but that had to be dealt with. And would I be able to step up and to deal with that? And did I have any management skills? Could I oversee something and get results and all of that? Having gone from a pure staff person,
right.
Law, government, politics, strategy, could I do real management?
Where did the germ of the idea come from to put C&O, B&O, Chessie together with Seaboard? Why? Now, the SP was in the mix there at one point.
Very much.
Curious about the dynamics and how that all developed.
Very much. I think what happened is Ben Biagini was the head of the Southern Pacific, and he'd approached Prime Osborne and Tom Rice initially, who was the CEO at Seaboard Coastline. Prime was the number 2, approaching them about a merger, and they'd agreed to a merger, or virtually agreed to a merger. And then some haughtiness appeared, and I think Ben called Tom or called Prime after they had this memorandum of understanding about the merger, and said something awkward to them that was off-putting. Said, how are you going to like working for me? And Prime and Tom didn't take well to that, and saw that this was a takeover, and they then began to think about alternatives. And they knew something had to happen because the mergers were in the works at that time, right. And saw some vulnerability. And Hayes called up. I think he may have told you this in his interview. Got together with Tom Rice, and they met at the Commonwealth Club in Richmond and began to sketch out a deal. And
so that was Hayes's initiative.
Hayes' initiative. Hayes was very innovative and far-reaching in his thoughts, and he saw that this could be a good merger. He also understood the pride of the Seaboard Coastline and the rebuff that they felt they got from Ben Biagini, and he saw an opening, and he approached him and said, let's do a 50-50.
If you wouldn't mind going back through, you have B&O, C&O, Western Maryland become Chessie System, right. And then you had the Seaboard Airline and the Atlantic Coastline become Seaboard Coastline.
Right.
And then Family Lines, which
right.
included the Clinchfield and the L&N.
Right.
And so you have these two entities, and then you have the SP coming in, swooping in, trying to make an offer, right. And maybe we could take it from there.
And Ben Biagini upsets the social architecture of that deal. And Hayes Watkins, clever as he is, sees the opening, and he calls up Tom Rice, and he says, Tom, maybe there's something we should talk about here. And they met at the Commonwealth Club in Richmond, Virginia, sometime around, let's see, this would have been 78,
78,
79, something like that, yeah. And he got the ball rolling.
So that could have been the first transcontinental railroad if the SP had prevailed in that.
It would have been, yeah.
And that overall strategy took a back seat to the umbrage that the coastline took to, or Family Lines took to the SP's approach to this deal.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And in fact, it would have been a mistake, though, because I think the way it played out, the way history played out, was better for the rail industry and for the shippers. That is, the East getting its house in order and the West getting its house in order, and then proceed with the transcontinentals, if they were to come. But the East was in disarray, total disarray, and it would have made transcontinental mergers almost infeasible. There wasn't a solid, well-functioning Eastern rail system at that time.
And so the ICC had to approve that merger.
It did.
And it didn't seem like it took very long to do.
Well, a lot of hard work. I was involved on it from corporate, but there was not a lot of overlap, so there wasn't a lot of duplication. Very little in the way of horizontal relationships, so competition was not damaged. In fact, we made a strong argument that competition would be improved because the competition was not so much with other rails, it was with trucks. So we was a pro-competition, pro-truck, pro-railroad relationships with trucks. We made that the core case, and it pretty much sailed through the Interstate Commerce
And no
Commission.
opposition. The SP didn't come in and oppose it.
No, there was. I think there were side conversations and talks and so on. I forget, and a lot of labor issues, but they all got resolved fairly quickly, and that merger got approved at the end of 1980, and we celebrated and packed our bags and got ready to move. Those of us who were only 40 people were asked to come to the holding company. It was going to be small, focused, disciplined, low cost, and Hayes and Prime insisted no more than 40 people. So the message was going out. You're a staff function. The operating people, the big bulk of this operation is not in Richmond.
So how long did you do that before you moved over to become the
About 5 years in that senior staff role, where I got deeply involved with Conrail again, because the Norfolk Southern made a play for Conrail when Liddy Dole, when Reagan was president and Liddy Dole was secretary, an old friend of mine, and her husband Bob, who was also somebody I admired greatly, was the Senate Majority Leader, and Norfolk Southern, which always had its eye on Conrail, made a play for Conrail, made a bid for Conrail, $1.2 billion, I remember, and we at the railroad were concerned about what the impact would be on that on us.
Sure.
And opposed it. But I remember arguing to Hayes, we can't oppose it with nothing. We have to oppose it with an argument that we would be willing to buy it. And we then he asked me, well, go ahead and develop a strategy. So we put together an offer, a counter offer, and made the argument, always made the argument, going back to, this was 1985, made the argument that Conrail, if it's ever sold, it ought to be divided between the eastern railroads to create competitive balance. And that was our position all the way through, even when we got into the contretemps with with Norfolk Southern years later. That idea prevailed, and that was my Hayes said, I want you to lead this parade for us. Figure out a way that we can stop this from happening, making it clear that we want a balanced Northeast. So we were consistent in the idea that it ought to be, neither one of us should take it all.
Right.
And it ought to be a balanced Northeast. And we went and put together a proposal. I called up Morgan Stanley and said, we need a counter proposal here. And they said, well, what will your role be? And Hayes had authorized me to say we'd put $300 million into the proposal, and you got to find the additional 900 to match the Norfolk Southern. And I spent a lot of time then going around meeting with the members of Congress, John Dingell for one, a powerful member, chairman then of the House Commerce Committee, met with the Senate people. Strom Thurmond was head of Judiciary, made the case to Strom that this was anti-competitive. He gave me a hearing anyway. And in the end, Liddy Dole recognized it couldn't be done and backed away from it. So Big Conrail stayed on as a public entity for a number of years until, the 1996, 97, when we put our proposal on the table.
Well, Stanley Crane also wanted to keep that. They had that let Conrail be Conrail.
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
very much. And he did a great job of helping to turn it around, of making it viable. But the fact of the matter is that good as a railroader as he was, strong on operations, until the fundamental structural problem of excess regulation was dealt with,
Right.
it could not earn it couldn't earn its cost of capital. It couldn't be viable, and therefore the whole Northeast rail system, Chessie and NNW and so on, were vulnerable.
There was a point in time where you moved into the multimodal. I guess that was Hayes's strategy of let's
Yeah.
have this
Yeah.
one-stop shop of ocean carriage and barge lines and all. Can you spend some time
Yeah.
how that developed and what the outcome was?
That was Hayes's creativity at work, interest in finding new ways to do things. And I was at corporate then, before he sent me to the Chessie system, B&O C&O in '85. But before that, we'd acquired the barge line and the gas pipeline company, a company called Texas Gas.
Right.
And I spent a lot of time getting the barge line approved, the barge line approval case through the ICC because of something called the Panama Canal Act, which
Right.
made it almost impossible for a railroad to own a barge line, on the theory that if a railroad owned a barge line, it would suppress the barge line for the benefit of the railroad and put the barges out of business. We persuaded. We were very proud of our efforts there to change the ICC outlook and the law really on that subject. But we got into the barge line business. We got into the oil gas pipeline business. We expanded the hotel business. Hayes bought Rock Resorts, Lawrence Rockefeller's resort company. And in '86, I was then at the railroad, I left corporate, but we bought Sealand, the big ocean carrier that had pioneered the whole idea of containers.
Right.
Malcolm McLean was a powerful idea.
Yeah.
That you don't only have to handle that cargo once. You put it on the ship, and it moves over, and then it gets picked up by a rail or a truck, and so on. It doesn't have to get loaded and unloaded 4 or 5 times. And Hayes saw that as a growth industry, and we were living, with a declining industry, declining carloads.
Right.
And Hayes, I think, wanted to put growth into the business and saw the potential for some synergies between rail and ocean shipping. But mainly he saw ocean shipping as a growth business, which it was. The problem was it was a growth business that required huge amounts of capital.
Right.
And we didn't have that much capital. We were sort of in straitened financial conditions. And beyond that, as I learned, when it was my turn to be the CEO and oversee it, it was a biblical industry. Biblical in the sense it would have one good year and seven droughts.
Right.
And it took so much capital, and I came to the conclusion as an industry, it couldn't earn its cost of capital. It was structurally defective from the point of view of being able to earn its cost of capital, because it was so infused with non-market incentives, ownership by governments that were more interested in jobs and building ships than it was in bottom line profitability.
It was interesting if you go back in history. J.P. Morgan tried to, as he was a monopolist by strategy, tried to monopolize. He did a great job in New England with the New Haven and all its connections, and he tried to monopolize the ocean carriage business in the Atlantic, and couldn't do it. And I had a friend of mine who said that the ocean carriers reflect the best practices of the Phoenicians. Meaning, not much has changed in 3,000 years. And the margins in that business, as you point out, they're one good year and 7 bad years.
No, it's structurally flawed because it's not basically a market-based industry. It's a government-based industry.
Not an even playing field.
Not even playing field, and incentives that are not economic. I very much applauded Hayes's and wanted to see Hayes's concept of an integrated transportation company succeed, but realized we couldn't afford it, and that it was pulling down the stock value of CSX. So I decided we had to sell it, And when we recognized we were going to make a bid for Conrail, I had a source of capital, which was to sell Sealand.
And what did Hayes say about dismantling the strategy?
Hayes, the gentleman that he always was, acknowledged that it was probably the right thing to do, even as he regretted that we had to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, Hayes was a realist, and he was experimenting. He was always experimenting with things like the 3-unit structure.
Well, I wanted to get to
which
that.
I ended up having to dismantle, and he didn't hold it against me because he recognized that if he'd stayed, he probably would have dismantled a lot of things he had done earlier, because these were experiments. These were efforts to try and test things and see what would work. He was always pushing the envelope to see what would work. The irony is here it fell to me, the fellow he'd picked to be his successor, to undo some of the things after trying to make them a success. We ended up selling the barge line company. We ended up selling the logistics company, which was a very good company. We got a great price for it. All of that helped fund Conrail.
So talk about the 3-unit structure concept. Was that a product of his fertile mind?
That was his fertile mind.
Yeah.
And he always had objectives in mind that weren't obvious to those lesser lights like me who were watching what he was doing.
Right.
He had, I'm not even sure all of what he was doing was clear to him, but he had intuitions. And his intuition on the 3-unit structure was, it's time to put the two railroads together. Originally, we ran them as totally separate entities. And this was 86 that I guess the 3-unit structure came about. I was then CEO of the Chessie side. I found a wonderful guy named Dick Sanborn, was CEO at the family line side, the Seaboard side. And we were both sort of taken aback when we were called in one day and told that we were taking these two well-known railroad entities and turning them into 3 separate things called the 3-unit structure.
Well, did he come to you and say, "This is my idea, let's do it," or what do you think, or did you have another one of these roundtable votes?
No, there was no vote on this one. He had concluded that we had to merge the railroads. These were separate, different cultures, and we had to find a way to bring the cultures together. He always had some antipathy, misgivings. I talked to Mike about this earlier. Misgiving, and talked to you about misgivings about the overarching power in a railroad of the operating department, particularly the transportation side of the operating department. And he wanted to find a way to lessen, in some ways, the significance of the operating department and get them more attuned to the other parts of the business that they were pretty much accustomed to lording it over.
Right.
And the 3-unit structure served that purpose, because now it wasn't the operating department, it was the transportation side of the operating department was separated from mechanical and engineering. At least from mechanical. Engineering stayed with ops, with transportation, but mechanical, the rolling stock, the locomotives and the rolling stock became a separate company, a profit center with a CEO and a CFO and so on and so forth. All the trappings of a real company. And then marketing and sales became a separate company. And we looked at this and wondered, how in the world is this ever going to work?
And the answer was?
So the answer was, and I was candid with Hayes that I saw it had some misgivings about it. And I'm sure Dick Sanborn, when we told him the same thing. And I'm sure Jim Hagan, who was with us then, both of whom went on to run Conrail later, had misgivings. And talking with them individually, I knew they all had misgivings. And we were polite to Hayes, but we said, "Hayes, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that?" And Hayes said, "No, we're going to do it." And he had McKinsey and Company. McKinsey and Company was accustomed, the consulting company, coming up with products. And this was a product of theirs, break companies up into more individual entities and more individual decision making and so on and so forth. Well, the only way to coordinate something like this was through what economists call transfer pricing.
Right.
So the locomotives would be priced out to the transportation people, and the rolling stock would be priced out, and the right of way would be priced out, and the marketing and sales activities would sell themselves to the operating side, and all of this, and that had to work through transfer prices. Well, we had to create a set of transfer prices.
Not an easy task.
Not an easy task. We did the best we could, and all of us had misgivings, but all of us, I mean, we respected Hayes and wanted to see this work. Didn't really have his intuition about why he was doing it. So part of but I figured out part of it was to get the operating side down to size, cut them down to size, get them to listen to people, get them to listen to marketing and sales, rather than dictate to them. Give the rolling stock people more credibility for what they were doing. The maintenance of the maintenance people, the maintenance of the rolling stock. Elevate the status of other parts of the operating company, and also merge, get us all, create a common enemy. Create a common enemy and create a bonding. So we all bonded as we tried to fix this crazy thing called the three-unit structure and make sense of it. We all came to sort of work with each other in ways to overcome some of the inherent inefficiencies of this. A quick anecdote. I was over years later. Margaret Thatcher is the prime minister, and her husband, Dennis, was brought on our board by Hayes as an advisor to the board. And this would have been 1988, the tricentenary of William and Mary coming to the crown. Hayes was the chairman of the board, the regent at William and Mary, the university. Ronald Reagan chose William and Mary to represent the United States at the tricentenary, the big deal 300th anniversary of William and Mary coming to the crown. So we go over. Hayes organized a party to go over. I went over as a working stiff, doing financial meetings with investors. But they would go to the Buckingham Palace, and they would go and do all these fancy things. And one day we got invited, one particular Sunday, to go out to the Prime Minister's country home. And Margaret Thatcher met us. And said hello to all of us and took us around and showed us the country home, and ended up sometime later being invited. Got to know her then. Invited to dinner at her home, and it's a very formal dinner. And I'm seated next to her, and she says to me, "What do you think of my efforts to privatize the British rail system?" And I say, "I applaud it. I'm for it. It's a good idea. What do you think about the way I'm doing it?" Well, she was doing it in a way that resembled the three-unit structure. The rail operating companies and separate rail
infrastructure
network rail.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, with all due respect, I applaud the idea, but I don't think you're doing it quite the right way. You don't believe in free enterprise." I said, "Oh, I do. I believe in free enterprise." And in fact, the U.S. rail system is organized on a free enterprise model. And that free enterprise model has led to the integration of these rail functions, not the separation. And you're separating them. I think she didn't like this, I think you are probably violating the market principles in doing this, and there's a better way to do it, but I applaud your..." Oh, she was mad at me.
You didn't get sent to your room?
I didn't get invited back. No, we became good friends, and so I think she ended up respecting me because in the end they recognized that was a fiasco, But anyway, we did our best with the three-unit structure. It caused a bonding among
That's what
all
he
of
said
us.
in the interview when I asked him about it. He said, the one positive thing that came out of it was it unified everybody. They were all talking to each other.
A funny little anecdote on this. The president of the railroad, I succeeded him a year or two later, but was a fellow named Paul Funkhauser. Paul had been the head of the family lines, and then, as in the tradition of 50-50, when Hayes moved up to be CEO, he came in as president, and a wonderful guy, a charming and delightful guy, who was well connected with NNW. I think he'd grown up in Roanoke, so he knew that NNW crowd, and he was in an elevator with Bob Claytor. And Bob Claytor, Paul told me this story.
And Bob's at the NNW then.
Bob's the CEO of the NNW. And he says to Paul, he says, you know, I'm curious. You guys were catching up with us. You were making real progress on your side, and we were really getting worried. But this thing you call the 3-unit structure, that's going to set you back 5 years.
Whoa.
So all the real railroaders saw this as curious.
Yeah.
Hayes' genius was to see it as a breakthrough that would do things that other people didn't contemplate. I mean, Hayes was really ahead of his times, and it did. It caused a coming together, a bonding of all of us to figure out how do we deal with this thing in a way to make it credible. And then it did cause the merger. Out of that, we created CSXT, the unified rail system.
Yeah, interesting.
And that again fell to me. When I became CEO at the parent, we said, no, it's time to unify all of
Now,
this.
did you know at that time that you were going to move up when he retired?
Yeah, I had. See, they'd brought me in to be president in '88, and that was sort of the signal. Sanborn, who would have been a competitor, had moved on to be the head of the Conrail. Alex Mandel, who had been head of strategy for us, who would probably have been on the short list, moved on to be president of AT&T. So I was the lone ranger. I was the one left.
Last man standing.
Last man standing.
So you got involved with this entity called the Business Roundtable and then the whole NAFTA thing. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. You know, when I was doing the government politics work for Hayes said to me, always keep your eye on government. In fact, he said, what goes on in Washington, I want you here to represent us, because what goes on here is as important or more important for the future of this company than anything that goes on in our boardroom. And he said, and keep that in mind. And when I came to Washington, I came to Richmond as head of those senior vice president. We went to Washington once a month to meet with Congress people. And he had a clever idea. Let's meet with Congress people who are new, because they'll appreciate you more and they'll remember you more. So he took a real interest in Washington, and I became sort of his sidekick. And we'd go to Washington once every 2 or 3 weeks, meet congressmen, stay in touch. And he really believed deeply in staying in touch. Same thing with the Virginia legislature that he courted. So government relations was something that he really valued and wanted us to stay on top of. I kept that in mind. I always kept the lessons I learned from him in mind. But back to your question now was on
the Business Roundtable. How you got into that?
Business Round. He'd been on the Business Roundtable, and he told me that the Business Roundtable is the best way to keep in touch with the interconnect between business and government. And through the Business Roundtable, you meet all these CEOs who are involved. You learn a lot about their companies. It's a collegial group. But he said you also find easy access to the very highest levels of government. And he urged me to join when they asked me to join as his successor. And I did. And interestingly, I got an assignment when I went on the board at the Business Roundtable, which was to be the chair of the Tax and Budget Committee. And Clinton had now become president, and first it was W's dad, 41, and that gave me a lot of interaction with his dad, because his dad was pushing a concept known as the what was it called? The Balanced Budget Amendment to the Constitution, based on the theory that Congress was set up to perpetually create deficits, and we needed some sort of a set of incentives or restraints on Congress. So I interacted with the Bush administration fairly closely, and became close to 41's dad, to 41, and to a lot of the people in that group, Andy Card and so on. So I became a proponent of the balanced budget amendment in that role as chairman, and that gave me a lot of interactions with the White House. And then he loses because of the third party candidate from Texas, who screamed about the budget deficits, and he would have won otherwise for sure. But Bill Clinton surprisingly becomes president, and as chairman of the Business Roundtable, there was a lot of interaction with the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton, very personable, and wanted the support of the business community. So we had regular meetings. I remember taking groups in to see Bill Clinton, the CEOs, and they'd say, "Why are we going in to see this guy? I don't have anything in common with this guy. He's the wrong guy. He shouldn't be president. I don't care for him at all. He'll take the country the wrong way." And we go in and see the president, and he'd sit down and talk with them, and of course charm them, as he always does. And we'd walk out, and they'd say to me, "God, he's a wonderful guy, isn't he? First, I don't want to meet with him. He's terrible. Taking the country the wrong way. Can't stand him." Walk out saying, "Boy, I'd like to go back and see him. He's marvelous. He's so charming and so winning," so on. I had a continuous interaction through the Business Roundtable with the senior levels of the U.S. government, and interacted closely. Gingrich got the contract with America in '94, swept out a lot of Democrats. Gingrich comes in as Speaker, gets on the cover of Time magazine as Prime Minister. Goes to his head a little bit, I think. But Clinton knows how to play that, and they then become allies in doing some important things. Bill Clinton triangulates, adopts some of these ideas, and decides he ought to be conservative on budget issues, and becomes a champion. It says famously, "The era of big government's behind us." Remember all that?
Yeah.
It seems like ancient history now, but I remember it distinctly. And we at the Business Roundtable, who were interested in budgetary issues and tax issues and in trade, became supporters of his agenda for NAFTA, his agenda with Gingrich. Gingrich was a key part of this. They teamed up well, used each other to accomplish things. They neither could have gotten alone. And it became a fertile period for good public policy. And the balanced budget stuff produced a deficit, ended the deficit miraculously at the end of the Clinton term. And I remember talking to Alan Greenspan, who was part of that circle, who came to the Business Roundtable often, saying, "Mike, we're going to have a problem here, because without government deficits, there won't be enough government paper to trade to conduct monetary policy, which is based on largely, on buying borrowings of the federal government. How are we going to conduct open market operations? FOMC, how's it going to conduct monetary policy, which runs through buying the debt of the United States?"
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's
so that was
something you don't hear about.
That was an exciting and important period for the country. Yeah. And Bill Clinton, in retrospect, wish he hadn't had some distractions, but he was a good, sound, centrist president on his policies.
Yeah, right. I sat next to the chairman of the Republican Party for Connecticut on a flight to D.C. one time, and he said how he had been invited to breakfast with the president, and he said, "I expected to go over there. I wasn't excited about it. I expected to go and be in a room of 40 people or something." He said, "No, there were 4 others and the president." And he said, "You'd walk out of there, you'd have done anything the guy wanted." He was just very influential that way.
I remember one day in the Oval with him, we were talking about, he invited me in, and there were only 3 or 4, like you say. He didn't need an entourage, and we were discussing the budget stuff and trying to get our support, and I was offering our support, and a bee came buzzing by, buzzed me a couple times, and he got up from his seat and shushed shushed the bee away, and he looks over at me and smiles, and he says, "See what your president does for you."
Yeah, that's right.
Always at your service.
Yeah, hands
President,
on.
always hands on, always at your service.
Right, right. So the big 900-pound gorilla in the room here today is the Conrail deal.
Right,
Right. I mean, that was, if it's not the deal of the century, it was certainly among the top
Right,
things that happened. And I think we would like to spend as much time
Sure.
as we can on that. And maybe just start, you'd already talked about the prior failed attempt of doing that deal jointly, the split up of it. How did it talk about your thinking behind it?
This was at a time, you'll remember well, when the Western Railroad mergers were getting underway. And they were beginning to consolidate the West, the UP and the SP and the Fresno and the Santa Fe and the Burlington Northern and so on. You were part of all that. And we could see that the East was going to have a problem because once the West got organized, they would be big and strong and successful and wealthy and have capital and have their eye on expansion. And we had a fundamentally unstable East. And the part of that instability was Conrail, which was still a government-supported entity, still part of the government. And if I realized, and I think Norfolk Southern should have, that if either one of us tried to own it entirely, it wouldn't work, because it would create an unbalanced East, which wouldn't fly with the STB or the Congress. So seeing the risk, we began to think, and I talked to our board about this. We kept the board advised at virtually every board meeting from '95 on about Conrail and the merger situation that was playing out, how we could play the game. Had lots and lots of maps. And we had the rail people and the corporate people working together to draw up maps of how it might be divided, recognizing in the end it was obvious it had to be divided.
But didn't you go all in at first for the whole enchilada?
Well, let me give you the background to that. The background of that is we knew NS was looking at the whole thing. And how did we know? Because we had teams discussing with NS a division. And we'd drawn up maps and given them basically whichever half they wanted, actually whichever 60% they wanted, because we recognized that we were larger than they were, and that and to create a balanced system, they ought to have a larger part of Conrail than we. So the maps we gave them always gave them the larger part, but it was basically how it ended up. It was basically NS with 60% being the Pennsylvania, the old Pennsylvania, and its accompaniments, and us, the New York Central, with its various pieces. That's about a 60-40 split, which is where it basically ended up, 58-42 or something. And I had a map drawn up and given to NS. And it was sending a message to them. It is, we don't want the whole thing, and no, we can't have it. You decide, you take this map, which divides it, and you decide which of these two maps you want. We'll take the other side. It was the ultimate fair deal. And when they rejected that deal, I knew they were intransigent. I knew there was...
Why do you think they rejected?
I think they wanted the whole thing.
But that wasn't really practical, was it?
It shouldn't have been. They should have known better. Our folks spent countless hours and got utterly frustrated dealing with Norfolk Southern because of their rigidity in rejecting everything. No, 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 no. And we got so many no's that we realized they wanted a much bigger part than the 60% or 65% we were prepared to give them. But now Norfolk Southern is financially stronger than us. We have the Sealand problem, which is a cash drain on us. We have traditionally a weaker balance sheet. They've got they've got an ironclad balance sheet, a fortress balance sheet. So we knew in an all-out bidding war, they would have more resources to deal with. So we had to either get them to agree or had to somehow get their attention. And the way to get their attention, in the end, when I knew they were talking to Norfolk Southern, there was no secrets. We knew Norfolk Southern was talking and had made offers and thought they had a deal. I think they thought they had a deal with Jim Hagan. And then David Levan came in and apparently upset that deal. So we were well aware that they wanted what we regarded as a disproportionate share of the assets and lines that would have put us at a competitive disadvantage. And of course, we had a fiduciary duty to our shareholders to make sure that didn't happen. And so once it became clear to us that they were intent on taking the whole thing, we had to have a counter strategy. And that counter strategy involved going to having conversations with Conrail, David Levan, the new CEO, and saying, let's make a deal. Let's find a way to make a deal. And part of the deal was social architecture, boards, location, and so on. Right. And NS was probably a lot less flexible on boards and social structure and equality and participations and so on than we would be. So we gave them a better social structure, social architecture than NS could. No, and we knew that. NS was inherently a little more prone to dictate outcomes than to be partners, as we'd learned in our negotiations. So we met with Levan and did a deal, and then
for the whole thing.
For the whole thing, it's continuing to send messages, real message to NS that we still want to do a deal with you. Now this is a real study in what economists call game theory. And one particular part of game theory is something called the prisoner's dilemma.
Right.
And the prisoner's dilemma involves these guys in prison who are given a deal. And the best deal for them is not to take the deal that enriches them individually, because they're each offered commutation of their life sentence if they'll confess. Which is very promising. Commutation, freedom. But if they don't confess and the other guy confesses, they get hung. But if they both confess to their sins, both confess, they get a light sentence. So the right strategy is to both confess and reach what is for the collective, for the two of them, the welfare enhancing,
best possible
optimizing outcome. Well, that was a prisoner's dilemma problem we had, and we kept sending them the message that got rejected for some reason that, look, let's pick the outcome here that maximizes the welfare for all of us. And somehow I wasn't effective enough in communicating the message, although how I could have been clearer, I don't know, except taking a microphone to Roanoke or to Norfolk or buying advertising space. But anyway, we ended up, in April of, what was it, 96, announcing that we were going to do the deal because we'd frustrated we'd frustrated the rational outcomes that should have occurred. So we did what we had to do. But I knew going into that in the end we couldn't have. We made a bid for the whole thing that we would never end up that way. Public policy, and our own prior statements were to the contrary, that it had to be divided. In the end, we paid a little more for it than we should have, created some turmoil, but. You looking at it, we paid more than we should have, and went through some disruptions in the putting the two together, which would have occurred anyway, I think.
Probably.
But the outcome has been a real blessing to the shippers and to the railroads and to railroad investors. Just think, CSX today is worth 75 plus billion. NS is comparable. And so we've created a massive increase in shareholder value. The market applauded what we did, and the extra couple of $1 billion we paid is minuscule in proportion to the value that's been created by that merger.
So one of the interesting outcomes of that was the shared asset concept.
Right.
Where did that generate from, and how did it get agreed to?
That came out of the recognition that we had to solve the prisoner's dilemma, and that neither one of us could control those areas totally. So we had to share. It made us good neighbors. We recognized that it had to be shared assets, and that we had to cooperate. Here we were bringing the Hatfields and the McCoys together to cooperate because we had to. We had no other option, and we had to sell the merger in a way that dealt with those shared areas, the coal fields and the New York area.
So you got agreement from them on that?
Oh yeah,
fairly
yeah,
easily.
we all recognized by then that had to be shared.
So,
And it had to be shared in a way that neither one of us dominated it. So we set up that separating operating company for the shared areas.
so you have issues at the railroad with track conditions, service problems, and things, and you're busy doing this deal. But the story that I have unearthed through our research was that when you learned of these things, you found a way to parachute in there and sort of address them. And I guess the question that comes to mind is, what was going on where these problems were occurring that people aren't giving you enough information on the surface to be able to cope with
Well,
those?
I think we had pretty good information. I mean, the shippers. I talked to the shippers even though I was at headquarters. I had good relations with a lot of shippers, and the senior people at the General Motors and Ford and the coal companies and the ag businesses and so on. I knew it wasn't working well. It wasn't working well at NS either. I mean, neither one of us. And it hadn't worked well at SP and UP. In fact, SP UP was a disaster.
Yeah.
And it had affected all the rail system. When you get right down to it, Brooks, putting together two massive rail systems is a complicated and difficult problem, even without the need to blend cultures. And both NS and CSX needed to deal with the inherent complications and the IT problems that came out of it, and the personnel problems. And we did it. We did a manfold effort there, and we learned as we went. But there was a lot of stumbling around. As more and more I recognize. I think David the same thing. The more and more he got into it, he wasn't an operating guy either. But the more each of us got into it, we recognized this is more hands-on than we're accustomed to. And I started going to Jacksonville regularly, spending a lot of time in Jacksonville, and changed out the team somewhat. Found some of the people who hadn't done as good a job as we thought they would, and had counted more on some of the Conrail people to know how to integrate this, knowing the region than and we ended up finding some people at CSX. Mike Ward, came into his own then as they asked him to sort of oversee. Pete Carpenter, was the CEO of CSX. Mike Ward. They ended up wrestling with this problem and bringing it to ground. But it took a while. It was painful. It was painful, and I ended up having to get back into the weeds on railroad stuff.
I know you hired a guy named James Schultz to do safety and really help. I guess the question really, obviously safety is critical, but it revolves really around culture change. And how do you go from the retribution and military environment into a more collegial?
He was important. Pete Carpenter was really important here. Pete played a critical role, as did a guy named Jerry Nichols, who was then our chief operating guy, a wonderful human being. Pete was a hardcore railroader. He'd come up the operating side and then gotten into marketing. Jerry was operating all his life. And we recognized that we had difficult labor relations problems, and that there was something fundamentally wrong about this punishment system that was inherent in calling railroad employees before boards and then chastising them and doing court sort of procedures with them and so on and so forth. So we began meeting with, Pete was really at the center of this. I applauded it. But he and Schultz and company changed the culture. We talked to the heads of the various unions, operating unions, about how do we make this collegial? How do we get out of being this military justice system and incorporate a set of incentives for you all to take charge of this? Safety is as important to you or more so than it is to us. Let's find a way. And then they got into the details, and Schultz and Pete Carpenter and Jerry Nichols, of restructuring labor management relations around discipline. And we recognized that discipline wasn't this hardcore sort of military discipline system, court-martial. It was like court-martials.
Right.
There was a counterpart to court-martials, and they didn't work. And they put you in an antagonistic position with the people who were most important to producing the product. And at the end, I got some credit from when I was nominated and went up for the Senate confirmation. Got applauded by the rail unions who supported my nomination. And they said we had changed the culture.
They said the quote is, "We build a relationship with CSX that rivals anything else we've ever had in our history." That was from the UTU.
Yeah.
That's a interesting compliment.
That was Fred Harden, we had very antagonistic operations with them and with the clerks and with the maintenance people, the electricians. We had difficulty with up and down the line. And it only changed once we changed the culture and brought them in as partners on safety. Not antagonistic, but partners. And we may have been in the lead on that.
So there was a time in 1999 when Linda Morgan was on your case about.
Oh yeah.
And do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, Linda was the chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. She'd been
STB at that time.
Was it STB by then? Had it become STB?
Yeah.
Really? When did the ICC get eliminated?
Well,
get changed?
80 was dereg, but
STB came later. It came later. It was an initiative of the mid-90s from an Ohio congressman that went on to become governor, who ran on the fact this isn't. Who was that? Anyway, he ran for president. This governor who was somebody I knew and dealt with. Anyway, you're right. It was STB by then. She was the first chairman of the STB, and had known her fairly well. She'd been a staff person for Fritz Hollings, who had been powerful chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee that oversaw railroads and all of transportation. And Linda was a lawyer, high-minded person, principled person, good public servant. And she loved railroads. She wanted to see railroads succeed. And she was worried I think the ICC had approved the UP-SP merger, and I don't know if she'd been on the board at that time or not, but she carefully tended to her information network on what was going on the railroads, and she was getting all these reads from her network about problems, and they were real problems. We knew them. And we talked to me about it. We had to get this fixed. And I agreed, and maybe that's when Schultz came in. And Schultz was a breath of fresh air for it. He came in from the FRA, and he'd been the head of the FRA Enforcement Bureau, I think. Anyway, he had been a senior official of FRA on rail safety. Brought a wealth of knowledge to us and was a good cultural fit, and helped us deal with the FRA.
How'd you find him? I mean, obviously knew who he was.
We knew he was a well-known figure in the rail world, and I was delighted to bring him on board. And he worked real well with our people and fit in, and but Linda and he and Pete Carpenter and Jerry Nichols and then the changed relationship with the unions, it all began to click. Late 90s, early 2000, 2001, 2002. And we always had in mind, interestingly, Norfolk Southern as the competitor that had the better finances and the better operating ratio. And we were determined to find a way to close the gap and ultimately, surpass NS in earning power, which I think has been done. And we did to the end of Pete Carpenter's career. He and a fellow named it's a credit to the NS that we modeled them because we recognized they were the standard in a lot of areas. Right. In some areas, others were, but they were the standard in a lot of areas. And I rejected the fundamental proposition and convinced Pete Carpenter to reject it as well, that NS had inherent advantages because their coal flowed downhill, which was sort of a myth inside our Eastern Railroad component, Northeastern Railroad component, that NS had inherent advantages that God and nature had given them, and that we couldn't overcome them. Well, we couldn't allow that to persist. So Pete, with the aid of the then CFO at the railroad, a guy named Paul Goodwin, who ultimately I brought up to be CFO of the holding company, established a rigorous effort to benchmark the NS in virtually every component of operations, up and down the line, mechanical, rolling stock, track structure, revenue per ton mile, on and on and on, every measure. And we were found wanting in a number. And so we said, we got to close the gap. And they then set up, became the center of operations at the railroad. The headquarters was setting up something called performance improvement teams to model the gap and close it. And a powerful force in that was our then head of mechanical, a guy named Carl Taylor, who'd come out of at Stanford and then engineering, and then I think had worked at several other railroads and worked for Claude Brinegar at the oil company, at Union Oil, and was a brilliant guy and really into metrics and zero defects and all of that, and brought a real hard-hitting engineering discipline to this. And he brought our mechanical costs down, rolling stock, locomotive costs down enormously. But anyway, we did that with every component of costs. And by the end, by the time I left the railroad, we had really closed the gap. I think our operating ratio by then, the railroad was lower than the NS. Of course, none of us foresaw. We then thought, getting into the 70s was good. We hadn't yet heard of the dramatic revolution that was right around the corner, right. Getting the ratios down into the 60s, and taking the railroads well into revenue adequacy, which had been the goal, revenue adequacy.
Now you had 3, I think, ex-Conrail people come in to run operations.
Yeah, we did.
And that didn't really work the way you wanted.
There was disappointment to us. One of them worked out well, a guy named Les Passa.
I remember Les, yeah.
Les was good. A couple of the others didn't, for one reason or another. I mean, it's difficult to come from a railroad based on one set of operating principles. Heavy loads going between nodes, and the sort of railroad system that much of the CSX was, which was lighter densities, smaller loads.
Right. Kind of went everywhere.
Went everywhere. Yeah, it was a different, with just a fundamental different operating mentality, and it didn't fit the nature of the rail system that CSX had, which was a lot more small loads and so on, less point to point, heavy loading.
So the financial performance was sort of up and down during that period. Do you have what's your take on the cause and effect of that?
We had coal. We had the recession at the end of that period. We had earlier period when coal started to disappear, from the rail system. And rail, for both of our systems, we'd been the core.
Heavy coal.
Heavy coal loadings was the core. America was beginning to deindustrialize. Steel was becoming less. Railroads were built to serve the heavy industry of America, when America was the industrial powerhouse, and America was we were getting deindustrialized. If you weighed the GDP of the United States in 1950 or 1940 or 1930 and weighed the GDP of the United States in 2000, you would have seen a dramatic change. GDP was up a lot because of services. And the American economy, is now 80% services. Industrial sector is way down. Employment is down even more because the industrial sector has become so efficient.
Right.
But industrial sector is what created those well-paying carloads. And as the industrial sector declined, so did those well-paying carloads. And there was a diminished role for steel, aluminum, even chemicals, plastics, heavy loads, autos. And we were caught up in that. So that affected earnings. But coal particularly, which export coal it took a big downturn in that latter part of that period. So we were going through some difficult economic times. We were no doubt about it. It was a tough time.
There's a point in time in which you've now got the railroad to some semblance of stability and everything, and then you decide, okay, I'm going to go back to government. Can you talk about how you decided to exit the industry? And
yeah, well, I didn't plan to. We decided by this time, this is 2001, 2002, we had streamlined the railroad. We'd completed the Conrail transaction. We had sold the non-rail businesses, basically, Sealand and the barge line and refocused the hotel group. We'd managed to streamline the railroad, streamline the business, and become a rail company. So the headquarters no longer made any sense because you didn't need a CFO for the railroad and a CFO for the holding company and so on. Didn't need a chief legal officer for the holding company. There was really no purpose for the holding company anymore. Whereas originally there'd been a real policy and planning purpose for the holding company. That had ended when we had bought Conrail and sold the non-rail businesses. So it was time to consolidate and the place to consolidate was Jacksonville because it was the headquarters of the railroad. So I talked to the board and said it was time to move to Jacksonville, consolidate, and to begin my succession planning process, and that had to be one of the railroaders because we were now a railroad company. We're no longer a transportation conglomerate or a conglomerate company. And then we began a process of looking at who might be the successor. And there were a number of good picks, good choices. We spent a couple of years figuring that out, and then we ended up. And the board asked me to stay on for a year. We'd move the headquarters to Jacksonville in 2002, and would I stay on for a year as the non-operating chairman? And I was reluctant to do so in the Hayes Watkins tradition, that once you've done your thing, you get out, and that was his rule.
Yeah.
And I wanted to follow that rule, so I said I'll be the non-operating chairman for a year. Moved to the Jacksonville area to do that, but not Jacksonville because I wanted to be out of the hair of the new team, knowing that always if the old guy's there, you're going to get people coming to you and saying they're doing this. What do you think of that? I didn't want to have any of that, so I stayed clear of the railroad, and then I'm over in London. It would have been like October of 2002. And the call is from Andy Card, the chief of staff, my old friend who'd been Secretary of Transportation, the chief of staff to the President of the United States. And I was in the UK to deal with, it had become the co-chairman of a blue ribbon panel on corporate governance set up by the conference board. This was in the wake of all these disastrous corporate developments like Enron and others that were a scandal. and we needed to clean up corporate governance. And I was involved in corporate governance and was in the UK to see how they were dealing with corporate governance issues, like should there be both a chairman and a CEO? Should the CEO be chairman or not? And so on and so forth. What role should the chairman have or the CEO have in picking board members? What's the selection of board members process going to be like? And so on and so forth. All these corporate governance issues that interested me.
Yeah.
And I'm over there talking to their counterpart to the Business Roundtable or the Business Council. And this call comes in from Andy. And he said, hey, John, would you come see me? And I said, sure, I'm happy to. I'm in the UK. And I'll see you when I get back. He says, well, as soon as you can, we'd like to see you. Want to talk to you about some things. And I think they want to talk to me about economic policy and some stuff. So a week later, I'm in the White House, and I say hello to Andy, and he says, I want you to meet some people. And I go down, and I meet these folks who are the personnel people. And I'm wondering, what am I doing here? And they say, what are you going to do now, Mr. Snow? What are you going to do with your life now? You're stepping down at CSX. What are you going to do? Have you got any thoughts? Would you ever think of returning to government? And I said, oh, no, I have no interest in returning to government, not really interested. And they said, well, there's an opening at the SEC. We need a new chairman. Would you be interested in being the chairman of the SEC? I was pretty clear. I said, no, not on your tintype. I would never want that job. And you shouldn't want me either, because I'm identified with corporate America, and the SEC oversees corporate America. You'd get criticized for putting the wolf in overseeing the hen house or something. And as I'm walking out, a lady says to me, who ended up being the head of personnel a year later, Mr. Snow, I wouldn't be quite so definitive in your response to that question. So then I get ushered into some other people, and then other people, and I'm meeting all sorts of people, and then I end up in the chief of staff's office, or the deputy chief of staff's office, with a number of the senior policy people, and the legislative and the policy people, and the political people. And it's a small room, and they say to me, John, what do you think of our economic team? And I said, well, you know your economic team better than I do. Why are you asking me? Well, we're interested in your thoughts. So I teased him. I said, well, I know all those people. Are the sound systems on here? Is this off the record? And they said, yes, off the record. I said, well, look, you know the problem as well as I do. You got 3 very talented people. The Secretary of the Treasury, Paul O'Neill, brilliant fellow, ran Alcoa, strong-willed, excellent on budget and analytics, seasoned, a good friend, actually. Larry Lindsay, brilliant macroeconomist, as your head of the Economic Council here, and a well-trained economist who'd come out of Columbia, was dean of the Columbia, or went on to become dean of Columbia Business School. They're all talented guys, but they don't get along with each other. You've got a problem with the team. They're all individually good, but they don't get along, and everybody knows it. Oh, they say, so you think our economic policies are okay? And I said, I think basically your policies go the right way. So we continue on with this sort of discussion, and the first thing they said to me when I came in, interestingly, was, "Are you interested in the SEC?" And I gave them the same thing, and they laughed because they knew. So finally, goes on for an hour or so, and we talk about the administration's tax policies and so on and so forth. The administration was then pushing a tax bill to have a complete zero tax on dividends. On the theory, the not wrong theory, the dividends are taxed twice. They're taxed at the corporate level, and then they're passed on to the investor, and they get taxed there. So it's double taxation. And so I said, I think you're on the right path with that. And we talk about some other things, trade and stuff. Well, anything you don't like? And I said, well, I think you're wrong on tariffs, on steel tariffs. I think that's a mistake. Well, you understand why we did it. Yeah, I understand why you did it. You had to win West Virginia and so on. I understand that. But I hope you can get them off as soon as you can. Well, then somebody comes in and says, your next meeting, Mr. Snow. And my next meeting, lo and behold, is in the Oval with the president. And he has a good sense of humor. And he looks at me and he says, John, glad to see you again. He says, I guess you're not...
This is W.
This is W. This is 43 himself. Cordial and smiling and pleasant as he is and charming as he can be. And he says, hey, I guess you're not interested in the SEC, are you? So I kidded him and I said, well, boy, news travels fast in your White House, doesn't it? So then we sit down and have a chat, and very discursive chat, this and that and so on and so forth, and doesn't really go in any one direction, except he asked me about economic policy stuff, and I mentioned, I read in the Washington Post today that there's a disagreement among your advisors on what you're going to send up to the Hill in terms of tax policy. And he said, yeah, they're arguing out. What do you think? And I said, well, I favor the idea of lower marginal tax rates and lower rates on capital. I think that'll be a big boon to the economy, and we need some stimulus coming out of the downturn that we've had, the dot-com bubble, and also 9/11, which adverse consequences there. So the economy was sort of had slowed down a lot and was in a recession basically. I said, I think those policies are good insurance against a recession. But he says, well, what do you think about the centerpiece of it, the dividend policy? I said, well, that's an interesting idea. And I come down with your economic tax policy people on the idea that dividends should get taxed only once. He said, why is that? And I said, well, in economic theory, there's a concept of earnings ought to be taxed once, but only once. And that's what that policy is rooted in, that idea of taxing income once. Oh, he says, is that a good principle? I said, yeah, Mr. President, I think that's a pretty well accepted, solid principle in economics. Oh, he says, I like that. He says, I really like it when I can argue from principle. And I thought to myself, well, they're going to adopt an exemption of dividends from taxation. And of course, they ended up doing that. So we leave. This was a discursive conversation. And out of the blue, he asked me if I knew any, kept in touch with international finance ministers. And I said, I knew a few, but not many. And he says, and then he says to me at the end, and this is pure W. He said, well, John, let's part on this note. You're smelling us and we're smelling you. That's a Texas colloquialism.
Yeah, really.
That's a Texas colloquialism.
Yeah.
So then I leave. Don't think too much about it, but I know something's cooking.
Yeah.
It's not the SEC. And Andy Card calls me a few days later, and again kids me. He says, hey, John, you're not interested in the SEC, are you? And I said, no. He said, well, look, would you be interested in Treasury? And I said, well, that's a different kettle of fish. Right. And he says, well, you better start thinking about it, because in an hour you're getting a call from the president who's going to offer you that post. So that's how it happened.
Wow.
And why me? Gosh, I don't know. I suppose it goes back to the fact I was a known commodity to a lot of those folks.
Yeah.
That I had been in the Ford administration with some of them, like Rummy and like Andy Card and and Dick Cheney, and that I'd kept my hand at a distance in the game of Washington through the Business Roundtable, basically, and got involved in budget issues and tax issues, and worked with 41 on the balanced budget amendment, and stayed in touch, and was a known commodity to them, and was part of that that wing of that was the Republican Party then. It was known as a Republican supporter.
Yeah.
So that so that was but I didn't know W well at all. I only met him a couple times. Knew 41 much better, much better.
Well, hopefully he put in a good word for you.
I don't know. Maybe. No, I was close to him and really admired him.
Yeah.
He was a statesman.
Yes.
He was a genuine statesman.
Yeah.
The most, in terms of preparations, the most well prepared. As well prepared as anybody to be president. And if only he could have, his son had followed his path, we wouldn't have had the Iraq fiasco. Jim Baker, a final anecdote. Jim Baker came to see me, who'd been a former Treasury Secretary.
Right.
And of course went on to be Secretary of State under 41. Came to see me a day or two after taking office. And he said to me, you're going to learn why we didn't go into Baghdad. You're going to learn. You're going to learn. A good message. He was trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
But I think the powers that be in the White House had already decided we were going in. The other bit of good advice I got for the historical record was George Shultz, who may be the first former secretary to come to see me. And he gave me a good lesson. Like, you got to learn lessons from your elders and superiors in life.
Right.
He said to me, congratulated me and wished me well. And of course, he'd been Secretary of Treasury years earlier, and as well as Secretary of State. He said to me, it's a wonderful ego-inflating position to be called Mr. Secretary. He said, Mr. Secretary, he said, you're going to get asked the question, John, Mr. Secretary, how do you feel about this or that? How do you feel about the gold standard? Or how do you feel about exchange rates? Or how do you feel about the dollar? And he said, that's flattering. What's your view on this big issue that's affecting the country and the world? And there's only one answer. He said, the answer is, thank you for that question. I am honored to serve in this administration and to be an advisor to the president. But it's the president's decision. And I hope to help faithfully and capably implement his decisions. Now, you got to have that, because if the Secretary of State or the Secretary of War or the Secretary of Treasury has a view that's different than the White House, right, it ain't going to work.
Right.
It just can't work. There's got to be a coherent,
team play,
vertically, deeply coordinated point of view for the United States, senior officials of the United States government, coming from the president.
Yep. I'm interested in how you would characterize maybe 2 or 3 milestones that you would say, these are the things that I'm most proud of achieving, or the things that I did that I wanted to do. So that's one question. And then the second part is, what didn't you do yet, maybe, that you wanted to do?
Yeah.
And then the last part is, your family environment and how that all played into this.
Good. Great question. Life's filled with turning points.
And curveballs.
Curveballs, turning points, ups and downs, and things you'd like to do better than you did, and things you take pride in how they turned out, things that happened beyond your control. Life's basically a mystery. And we're all trying to figure it out. So milestones, well, clearly involvement with deregulation was a critical milestone for me. Something that I'll look back on with pride. I think the deregulation of railroads was foundational in creating the industry we know today, the successful industry that can invest and reward both workers and investors. That's an innovative place. It's creative, dynamic, and serves the commercial interests of America well, and importantly serves the vital national security and defense interests of America well. It's proving to be a vital national asset, critical to our place in the world, critical to global commerce, and to the success of the American economy. So my involvement with that foundational aspect of the renaissance of the railroad industry was important, deregulation. Frustrating the Norfolk Southern in its quest to dominate and control Conrail is something I look back on as a challenging and interesting chapter that turned out well for both of us. But an awful lot of my life was focused on dealing with Conrail, one way or another. One, using Conrail to promote deregulation. Another, achieving a balanced northeastern, midwestern rail system with a split of Conrail between Norfolk Southern and CSX, much as Bill Coleman and John Barnum had suggested back when I was a deputy to them in the Department of Transportation. So the whole play out of Conrail has been a milestone. And the renaissance of the railroad industry. But deregulation that we worked on also transformed the airline industry,
Right.
Created the whole world of low-cost airline fares. Airfares are probably in real terms 40% or more lower than they would have been otherwise. Trucking industry has been revolutionized.
Absolutely.
There is no more Teamsters union in the trucking industry.
Right.
I recall my conversations with Fitzsimmons and company, who thought I was the devil when I was pushing deregulation. John Dunlop, the secretary, the Harvard professor who became Secretary of Labor, was mad at me for pushing trucking deregulation, telling me I was going to destroy the greatest transportation system in the world. But trucking industry bears no resemblance to today to what it looked like in 1960 or 70 or 80. Jimmy Carter gets a lot of credit for that. Transformation in other things we touched, telecommunications and so on, which were part of that presidential review group. Were something I look back on with a lot of pride. America's a different place, much more productive place, because we got rid of a lot of needless, silly regulation and relied on markets. And what was deregulation really about? Mike and I talked about this earlier. Railroads with rate bureaus and regulation got out of touch with the markets.
Right.
Talking about overpricing things that the price looked great, but nobody moved it.
Right.
That's not a way to create a successful business.
Yeah, it was all about the process and the rules and everything.
So what deregulation was about was getting these industries back in touch with the markets and demand and supply and their customers. So those would be milestones. Now, along the way, there were turning points. That might have turned out a lot different. One of my professors at the University of Virginia was a fellow named Ronald Coase, who pioneered this idea of law and economics, and got the Nobel Prize for it, and wanted me to come and offered me a chance to come to the University of Chicago and teach law and economics. That would have been an interesting career.
Yeah.
I had offers from law firms to join the litigation departments and be a litigator. I would have enjoyed that. Had other industries at points in my career talked to me about doing that. Being a university professor probably would not have satisfied me. Sort of like Darius talked about. We have some bug in us that wants us to do some things rather than just think about things.
Right.
But all of that would have been satisfying. But I think I was lucky to find railroads, and find railroads at a time that public policy was so critical, and that I happened to have some exposure to or experience with, or even maybe a little talent at dealing with public policy questions.
And your family throughout all of this, I mean, here you are, you're a man on the go. but you have a family.
A great, yeah, and they've been so supportive. I've got Carolyn, unfortunately passed away, but a son in New York who's in the investment banking world, has his own private equity firm. Another son who's a professor of history in Montana. He would love to be here because he's deeply knowledgeable on the Revolutionary War period in the early days of the American Republic. And we have wonderful conversations about the Founding Fathers. I take such pride in him and his work in both of them. And then the youngest, Christopher, who's a blend of both, runs his own business and has entrepreneurial skills and commercial skills and so on. We set up a little family office, but it soon became clear to me that he had many more insights. The idea was I would provide insights and he'd do the work. Well, his insights were much greater than mine, and gradually I've just let him.
You faded out.
I've faded out because he's so talented in that. So, and of course, his mom, Carolyn, was just a source of strength to me throughout everything. She was the real anchor of the family and the brains of the family.
Well, on that note, we'll say we have a wrap. Thank you so much for coming up here to Ipswich in the middle of winter. And it was a treat to be able to sit down with you and talk about all of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Good fun being with you.
Likewise.